On today's episode of Airtable Makeover, we're going to help a podcaster with a very specific question involving advanced use of rollup fields. Let's get into it. I have two tables, and each has dated records. The first table is events. The second table is podcast airings. What I want to do is see when events land within a certain time period of a podcast airing so that I can include links in the show notes. For example, podcast airs today. I want to see any events from table 1 that are happening in the next 3 weeks from today's airing. How can I make that happen? First table we're going to call podcast airings. This table has a date field and we'll have a title field. Okay, and the title will be Podcast Episode 1, and the date in this case will be today, May 8th. All right, we'll do a concatenate function as usual. We'll call that title and date. We're going to want to use datetime format. We'll use the date. I always like the single L. We'll see how that looks. Great. Podcast episode 1, May 8th, 2023. So the first thing I want to do is figure out a date that's 3 weeks in the future. So let's take, we'll say 3 weeks from now. We'll make this a formula field and we'll do the date add function. We'll use the date from this field, adding 21 days. Great. Take away the time and you're looking good. Okay, let's get rid of these extra cells here. Can get rid of that status. Boom. Okay, so now we have today's date, 3 weeks ago. Now, we also want another table called events. And events has a description, or let's call it title again. We've got date. We'll use the date. And then we've got, let's call it URL. Great. And now I have this information pre-populated. Let's do date title URL to match the way we're going to bring it in. And let's go like that. Great. Now we'll use another concatenate function here to give this a unique title. We'll say concatenate title. And then that same date format. Date, comma, L. Boom, boom. Great. All right. Now we need to create a link between the podcast airings and the events. So let's do it from this direction. Let's link, we'll call this podcast airing. And we'll use the linked record. We'll allow multiple. Boom. Okay. And for simplicity, let's just copy this podcast airing to all of the events. Fantastic. Now let's roll up the date of the most recent linked podcast airing. Most recent podcast airing. Roll up. the date. We'll use max values. Great. Now let's duplicate that field and also bring in the date 3 weeks from that airing. We'll call this 3 weeks from most recent podcast airing. Now a formula field to tell us if this event record falls within the 3 week time frame. So we'll call that is within 3 weeks. This formula field is going to have an if statement along with and statement. So if two things are true, the first one being date is greater than most recent podcast airing, comma, so in other words, and date is less than or equal to three weeks from most podcast airing, close that out, then true, otherwise false. Great. So now we're able to tell which events are the ones that we want to include in the show notes. Now let's create the field that expresses what we want listed in the show notes. So we'll call this show notes description. That's going to be a formula field. Concatenate. We'll say date. Remember, date time format is always what you're looking for. I like to use this lowercase l. And we'll say hyphen title. And then in parentheses, the URL. Great. Now, each one of these event records has a single line expressing what we want to say about that event in the show notes. Now back to podcast airings. Using Rollup, we're going to say show notes period. It's going to be a Rollup field. Where we're going to roll up the show notes description. Conditional, whereby is within 3 weeks contains true, using the array join values with a line break so that we can stack them up nice. And there you go. Now you've got a very easily transposable field listing all of the events that you want included in your show notes. There you go. All right, hope it's been helpful. See you in the next one.